Well, hello everyone. I'm Andrew David, editor at large of Elemental, and I'm delighted to introduce the first of this week's webinars, which is homing in on decarbonisation in the healthcare sector. This one is very timely as it tackles the subject of healthcare and the balance between reducing carbon and the increasingly tight budgetary restraints. The healthcare sector is one of those areas that's been in the heart of the move towards new heating and cooling technologies too, thanks in no small part to the availability of significant funding via the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. And I suspect we'll be hearing more about the pros and cons of the PSDS and accessing it and getting the money and jumping through the hoops as we talk to our panelists. I'm delighted we have a cross section of the supply chain to share their experiences and hopefully also their advice on carbon reduction. So they are, in alphabetical order, Jamie Bartley, Chief Executive of the Unyte Group, Tim Rook, Head of Markets at Clade Engineering, and Janet Smith, Head of Sustainability at the Royal Wolverhampton NHS Trust. I'll ask them to tell us more about themselves in a minute. We will, of course, be allowing time for audience interaction, so please do put a short and succinct question and more than several sentences and they start creating havoc. In the Q&A section, feel free to use the chat for chat, but questions must go in the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So let's start. Panelists, let's have a few minutes of introduction and you can tell us about your experiences about reducing carbon. You all have distinct perspectives. We'll start with the people who are offering solutions and then move to the person who has to pay for it all. So let's start with Tim, then Jamie, and then Janet. So Tim, please tell us your perspective. Tim is looking at the screen, which is a worry, and he's disappeared. Jamie, do you want to give us your perspective to start then, as we overcome the technical difficulties like they're not even there? We seem to be struggling because you're on mute. We're seeing all kinds of trouble today. So while we work around in the technicalities in the background, I'm hoping that Janet's got a voice for us.
Yes,
we can hear you. That's a good start. Fantastic.
Yes, it's always these kind of things. You've got technical issues always comes up. So, but I think Jamie is back. So I don't know. Would you? We still can't hear Jamie.
Jamie's still on mute, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I will start. Yes.
Yes. Start. Let's go backwards, and let's talk about from the perspective of a client. What are you looking for? You're a head of sustainability. What are you looking for in the healthcare setting?
Well, I think the reality in us is that the trust has to deal with, of course, different sources of our carbon emissions, and one of them is, of course, the direct emissions, so our energy, and also scope 2 is part of it. And one of the biggest contributor, actually, when we did our carbon footprinting exercise, is that capital carbon. And capital carbon sits smack straight into, of course, decarbonizing. When we decarbonize our estate, when we actually transition our estate to net zero, then whether you're talking about new build, major refurb, or minor refurb, capital sits in there. And so capital actually is the third highest in terms of carbon emissions for us. So it is, and that includes, of course, all the embodied carbon from the supply chain, and that's where we actually do need to really work closely with the supply chains to ensure that we are looking at the embodied carbon, because that embodied carbon actually form parts of the carbon that we become responsible for. And I think that's where Jamie and Tim then can tell me what they have on offer to help me reduce that.
Okay, brilliant. Let's hope that we can hear Jamie now. Oh, he's still on mute. going through what is known as the presenter's nightmare today. It might just end up with Jamie having to write his answers on a piece of paper. Tim is now Tim's name has popped up, but he's not appeared in. Oh, I can hear a voice. Who's that speaking?
Is that me? You can hear?
Yes.
It's me. Okay. Right.
I can hear you now. That's very fascinating. Right. So, Jamie, would you like to tell us about who you are and where you're coming from?
Certainly, Andrew. So my name's Jamie Bartley. I'm the CEO of the Unyte Group, and we're very much focused on decarbonisation across the built environment, and that's both from Unyte Energy's perspective, where we undertake commercial and industrial retrofit and renewable energy efficiency generation systems, and then also through Unyte Hemp, where we're looking to really scale large volumes of carbon negative construction materials from industrial hemp, which again, to Janet's point, really helps reduce the embodied carbon, because hempcrete insulation, for instance, or hemp insulation as a fibre insulation, carbon negative. So therefore you're actually decarbonising further the properties that you're installing these in a retrofit perspective. So we really look at fabric first and demand destruction of the energy requirements for the estates, and then we look at how we can actually produce the energy in renewable solutions. We also get involved in energy from waste systems through pyrolysis as well.
You might need to give us 1 or 2 minutes on the world of hempcrete for
certainly,
our healthcare clients who've never heard of it outside of hemp bags and things like that.
Yep, certainly. So, I mean, the reason we focus on hemp as a bio-based material is because it's sequestered so much carbon when it grows in the agricultural field. So, to give you a comparison, 1 acre of hemp, when it grows in its 4-month growth cycle, will sequester 25 times the carbon dioxide that 1 acre of rainforest would in that time period. So, when we look at then using that biomass to make insulation or hempcrete, it actually really reduces the amount of carbon because it's sequestered so much both into the biomass but also into the soils as well. And then it's scalable, so it produces 4 times the biomass that forestry would in that time period as well. So it produces a lot higher volumes of biomass, and it has lots of layered benefits to an agricultural crop rotation. It improves following crop yields. It's a very good source of pollen for our bees and pollinators, so it improves biodiversity. And it gives us this biomass that we can then process. And hempcrete as a product is 100% natural. It's bound up with lime, and hempcrete, performance-wise, hugely reduces the heating requirements with the properties when it's used for the internal or external walls, because of its thermal mass, and therefore it has the potential to reduce the operational carbon required in properties when they use hempcrete. So that's the main reasons that we focus on hemp as a bio-based material, and it can be used for lots of different types of construction materials. Initially, we're focused on insulation because we believe that's where it can add the most value to both new build and retrofit sectors.
Okay, great stuff. We'll come back to insulation, I think, in a while. I'm relieved and delighted to say that I can now see Tim. And if you want to answer me, can you hear me, Tim? So we're halfway there.
Hi, Andrew. Yes,
now we can hear you now. Brilliant. Okay, so all that you've missed, Tim, is the introduction from Janet, and she's been talking about capital carbon, and Jamie's been talking a bit about embodied carbon and his one of his solutions. You represent the world of big heat pumps, amongst other things, which again is possibly new to some of the people tuning in. So this is your opportunity to give us a few minutes on where you're coming from with solutions for healthcare.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. So yes, so I represent Clade, and we deal with commercial and industrial heat pumps, in particular natural refrigerant heat pumps, which will be a new concept to many people. But we use the lowest carbon form of refrigerant, which is the working fluid inside a heat pump. We use CO2 and we use hydrocarbons. That's a little bit technical, perhaps, but where we're coming from is the most sustainable sort of heat pump that you can have for a long period. It also happens they produce high temperatures. So where we're talking about healthcare in particular, we're talking about existing estates which are complex. Sometimes they've moved away from steam or are in the process of moving away from steam. They've got high heating and cooling and hot water loads as well. Then high temperatures become very important. So that's something we can deliver with our natural refrigerant heat pumps. And we also do it at scale. So a lot of healthcare facilities would be quite large, and certainly the domestic hot water load is considerable. So rather than using lots and lots of small white boxes, which many of you will be familiar with for heat pumps, we're using big industrial machines that produce high temperature, reliably, efficiently, and are much more suitable for the healthcare environment. So, and of course, healthcare, your long-term asset ownership, long-term interest in the efficiency, as well as the carbon. So we're very focused on delivering not only the heat pump itself, but the project around it, to make sure that everything talks together, everything works together, and delivers efficient, reliable heat into a sector for which it's a critical application. It's you can't have hospitals without heat and hot water, and so this is super important to get right for healthcare. So there's a few particular things around healthcare that are important. And I think as a nation, we're right at the very beginning of how do we decarbonize this big sector of ours. And yeah, carbon reduction, yes, but also utility cost reduction and reliability are super critical as well.
I think we're going to come to utility costs in a minute, because my next question to Janet was going to be, as per the title of this webinar, it's all about the quest for carbon reduction, but then balancing that against the budgetary restraints that you've got. And I guess everyone's thinking about the costs in general of the NHS and private facilities, for that matter. So what does it feel like from at the sharp end when it comes to costs and sustainability at the moment, Janet?
Well, certainly it is a very big challenge, particularly given that in the last 2 years, more or less, the prices of everything has gone up. So, which means then that the project budgets, which might be at 2 million before, would come up to about 3 million now, just because of the prices going up. And also, there are certain things that I always look at when someone asks me actually about technology, about decarbonizing our estate. I always say to them that we wanted to collaborate with suppliers, but I also recognize that not all strands of our supply chain are actually in the position to respond to the requirements, because I know that even heat pumps, there was actually a bit of an issue with supply, with everyone with everyone trying to get heat pumps in. So that's the one thing. It's about chicken and egg. So are the technology actually mature and ready for implementation and actually getting into commercial? The other thing as well is that, are we actually, one of the key area that we look at when we're investing is that, is this the right technology for our right building? Because like what Tim had said, that healthcare estate actually is very complex. So in one of our sites, our buildings ranges from a workhouse, remnants of a workhouse, to one that was built 2 years ago. But in between that, you have 1920s, 70s, 50s, 80s building with different, of course, construction style, etc. So that has to be taken into consideration. And also, given that decarbonization is only one part of the whole pie, there is a bigger pie in there, which is actually our backlog liabilities. So which means then we need to balance the commitment to actually reduce our carbon emissions by decarbonizing our estate, with what we need to put in place as well to actually address our backlog issues, because those backlog issues will impact on the functionality of the building, and also that it's still fit for purpose for what it is there to deliver or support the clinical delivery. So given, although you did, about PSDS is a huge help, but it is not the panacea of the funding, because PSDS is very much focused on decarbonizing heat systems. It doesn't actually look at other aspects of it. So it's still the trust then to decide how to actually prioritize things. And given that we have, of course, a cost improvement program, we need to really look at, and this is what I would say to everyone, is that it's about looking at the business as usual that we do already, looking at our PPMs, our reactive maintenance, how we manage it, how we manage our backlog, and also ensuring that we are putting in, we are looking at things with a critical eye in terms of actually ensuring that sustainability and carbon reductions is actually that form parts of our PPM and reactive maintenance, and how we look at our minor refurb, which is not going to be covered by PSDS or other funding.
Excellent. That gives us a lot to be thinking about. Let's have a little think about PSDS, because it's. I think if you're a supplier, it's very much on people's minds, because we all talk about it unlocking some doors that weren't available before, and only last week there was the latest phase became open for applications. So I'm interested to know what it feels like from a supplier's point of view. So I'll start with Tim. PSDS.
PSDS, yeah, it's certainly transforming the supply chain. I think Janet, you're right. The supply chain is pretty stretched at the moment, and it has been for a little while. There is a global increase in the number of heat pumps that are being fitted, of all different shapes and sizes and scales, which has put the supply chain under stress. So we are encouraging our customers to engage early, to get the projects off the ground, get the kit on order, and really think about supply chain as a critical component. For a large heat pump, it can take 6 months from order to delivery, which is a long time. But in that cycle as well, we've also got grid constraints and planning permission and things like that, which take time to work through. And yes, you're right. Often healthcare jobs are very complex, so they need a skilled set of people who are working on them. And the sector is learning its delivery capacity, its ability to deal with these projects. It's all very much on a learning curve. So I think you're right in pointing out some of the challenges. I think we are addressing them as a sector, but there's definitely quite some way to go. The skill and expertise of the design team is pretty key. Sorry, Andrew.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in and say, what's the sort of the time scale from picking up a project on a PSDS scheme, and are you picking up? Is it for the client to say, I want to do something, or are you pitching in and saying, I think you should do something, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. A lot of people have now caught on to the PSDS. Back in 2020 when it was first launched, it pretty much, it was only a few companies and a few local authorities who'd really got their head around it. They won a lot of the £1 billion that was on offer then. But now lot of people, the competition's super fierce. I think this time round we'll see maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 6 projects get funded.
Right.
So the competition is stiff out there for it, and it's become quite a well-known process now. So the good question for me is, we've got likely one more phase after this coming, not been announced yet, and then you're into general election and so on and so forth. So what happens next? And that level of uncertainty is a bit tricky for customer side and for us, because what's the UK going to do now? It's barely scratched the surface of decarbonising the public sector. So there's got to be something, but what does it look like? We don't know yet. But we are seeing other forms of green finance come into the sector as well. So you've seen some examples with in the domestic sector with OVO and Octopus and Centrica coming in with their specific heat pump tariffs. We have a one called Plugged In, where we're taking away the capital cost. So we're starting to see some innovation in the finance and commercial space as well as the technology space.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Tim. So Jamie, what does the whole funding side feel like from your perspective? I take the point from Janet that PSDS is squarely focused on heating, which is possibly to the detriment of all the other ways you can reduce carbon. So what's it like from your side of the fence?
Yeah, I mean, I think to both Tim and Janet's points there, I think there is issues across the supply chain with uncertainty around some of the different funding schemes. There certainly is probably a need for some wider schemes that have a not as tight a remit, because otherwise there is going to be a risk that projects are going to be undertaken, especially when you're talking about the complexity of undertaking projects in a healthcare setting. And if there's opportunities there for insulating at the same time as looking at putting in renewable systems, that it would be a no-brainer to be not doing that at the same time, because you're only going to go back in and have a whole other project to deliver any of the fabric type measures that could potentially benefit the estates as well. Equally, I think because of the variability of the types of buildings as well, it does make it more complex. It's not the same as going into a traditional, say if you're looking at decarbonisation of residential properties and you've got a street of all the same properties, you pretty much know the works are going to be undertaken there as soon as you've assessed the first property. It's not that scenario. You've got to do a lot more fabric surveys and initial design and at the assessment stage to ensure that you're maximising the opportunities for both decarbonising on an energy and a heat perspective. So I think it's something that there is going to be a need, and certainly post-election, I'd hope that we see some confidence in some of these schemes and potentially longer running as well. I mean, I do think a lot of them, because of the time it takes to put together some of these projects, the schemes are actually a little bit short compared to some of the larger projects and the lead-in that they're going to need. So again, I think there's probably a need to maybe have a bit more longer term thinking about some of the duration of the schemes. And I mean, one of the main issues that we see across the board really is around the skills gap and not having enough trained, qualified installers for the different types of measures. So we have set Unyte Academy up earlier this year to try and assist with that, and we offer subsidised training now through Academy. But again, there needs to be a real push to bring people into the sector as well, because the need is huge still across all of the different areas that we need to decarbonise in, and we need an absolute army of people that are working within the sector to be able to deliver the levels of measures and works that are needed to get anywhere near the 2030 and the 2050 targets. So certainly I think skills is going to have to be a major focus for the next couple of years as well.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It is a skills gap across the board. I mean, when we were talking about the funding and the applications with Tim a couple of minutes ago, I was thinking that, yeah, the whole, it's a discipline in itself in applying for some of these schemes, and without stereotyping too much, the traditional world of HVAC, it's not necessarily geared up to these sort of complicated form filling and tendering and all that kind of thing. So it's marrying up technology specialisms with the sort of the bureaucracy specialisms, isn't it? So just very briefly, Tim, what's your view on that? Is it quite bureaucratic from a supplier's point of view? Then I'll come to Janet and ask her a few more questions about the world of the client.
Yeah, I think the approach is not too bad, actually. Yes, there's forms to fill in. Yes, there is feasibility studies to be done, but the system is learning, and the quality of questions we're getting asked by Salix who administer the fund is a lot better now. Right, they've still got some way to go, but they are actually asking some decent questions. In the early days it was a little bit Wild West, as these things are. But it's important that you set a project up correctly. And what we do see is consultants in particular who don't understand the full breadth of what is possible with a heat pump, or how you make heat pumps work properly, or how you integrate them with other systems like cooling. Who don't understand that. They set the project up a little bit wrong. They apply for funding gets awarded, and then the project is kind of it's hobbled before it starts because of some early decisions that were made poorly. So for me, it's all about getting expertise on the project at the front end and making sure that's carried all the way through.
Thanks, Tim. I'm now thinking there's a whole webinar on working with consultants from both sides of the fence. And Janet, so let's have a few minutes just to sort of describe what's on your desk at the moment. It's in terms of what's your workload. Is it sort of fairly split between maintenance and refurb, and do you have new build on the horizon, or are you mostly looking at the existing estate in your role? And the subsidiary question is, or the second question is, what is your experience of working with suppliers? What would help you? That's really what these kind of webinars are about, is how to move forward.
I think I'd like to first pick up Tim's point about and which also kind of answers the question, is that when it comes to PSDS schemes or any other schemes, it's always prudent to actually pull together a really good team, your technical team, something that a team that delivers, and a team that knows what they're talking about, basically. Because no disrespect to people, but there is what you call, there are designers and there are designers, and what Tim had said about, they know someone. You have to have people that knows the width and the breadth of what exactly you're trying to achieve, and translate it into a design and a scheme that delivers what it intends to deliver. That is quite important, especially if you're applying for PSDS funding, because PSDS is always concerned about the deliverability of the scheme, and at the same time that the scheme actually is designed and to deliver what it intends to deliver. So that's one of the big thing that needs to be worked on. When it comes to our estate, we always have like the small refurb type of thing. We also have, of course, our replacement program for medical equipment and general equipment, and we also have our IT replacement program as well. Then you have your minor schemes, and you have your major schemes. So there's always on the horizon new builds and major refurb, and also the small schemes. So when we're looking at major refurb, it usually involves all of those things. So your IT, your general equipment, your medical equipment, given that we're healthcare. So when it comes to working with suppliers, we then look at I think, I don't know whether Tim and Jamie, and I'm sure everyone that's in the call today, is that we're all aware that the NHS now is implementing 10%, minimum of 10% social value and sustainability weighting in all our tenders, and also that we require a carbon reduction plan now for anything, any contract 5 million and above. So that's one of the things, and also we encourage all our suppliers to sign up to Evergreen platform that would allow them to assess where they are in terms of their journey to vis-a-vis also the NHS requirement, supply chain requirement. So that's one thing. In terms of the challenge that we have at the moment is that we have a huge amount of course, estate that is current, complex, and different ages. And we know that we need to reach net zero by 2040. So which means then that any new build that we have needs to be net zero. And we need to have a really good transition plan to transition all the others into net zero by 2040. The challenge then is, how do we go about it? So we need to know exactly, because Jamie and Tim could tell me what to do, is that we have, let's say, a building that's 1960, no space for roof insulation, no space for wall cavity insulation. Basically, glass windows with aluminum frames, which during winter it's very, very cold. During summer it's very, very hot. So it's like, when you think about that, and when you have like 5 buildings like that, how do you actually invest, actually trying to transition it? Or do you put any new technology in it? But when you look at the market, there's nothing yet to actually address all of those. There might be some, you need to pull it together. So, but then it's a question then of, and I know finance people who might be here, is that actually a good way of prioritizing your funds, which is limited? Do you invest it on that, or do you invest it in another building, which is, in a better? So that's the challenge that we have at the moment. It's working at those limited budget, and prioritizing the type of technology that we can actually put in the type of building we have, on whether it is actually pragmatic to do it that way. That's where and that's actually a challenge as well, like for planners, because for new build, sometimes, although lots of people say they're a sustainable designer, but when I look at a building that someone has actually designed and presented as a sustainable building, the first thing I ask is that, those big, huge windows, have you considered how that will be, in terms of heat gain? And basically say, oh, I didn't realize that. So it's sometimes about looking at the nitty-gritty of things and having that critical sustainability mindset when you look at it.
It's interesting, isn't it? The architect community at the moment is going through quite a lot of soul searching about new designs versus whether refurbishment can match up to that with more sustainability, and whether you can repurpose rather than rebuild. And these are all questions that we've all got to come to terms with. I wonder whether Jamie, have you got any direct response to Janet's challenge of the building that is actually quite, it seems to be an uninsulatable building. That's what I was going to say.
Yes, I think that is going to be quite a problematic one, because no matter what generation solutions you put in place there, ultimately you're still going to be losing huge amounts of energy, ultimately as lost heat through the walls and through the roof. So I do think that's quite a hard one to really solve, and potentially falls into that bracket of, is there a way to actually put that function into a new build and then have a huge reduction of energy requirements, and therefore achieve net zero a lot quicker. But I think as well, it's a case of almost triaging based on carbon impact, and trying to assess what can be done in the specific scenarios, and then calculate up the carbon impact on those different options, and that sort of assists with triaging where the money can have the most impact. I think that's probably the only real viable way of doing it, and to do that you need to have a lot of information around the buildings, and you need to have a lot of specialist consultancy input from the likes of Tim and his team, and those specialists that actually do understand the different technologies, and therefore the viability of what those could potentially provide in certain scenarios. So I think it's about trying to have that early engagement with the specialist teams to ensure that all options are being considered at that initial feasibility stage.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, you were saying that you felt that not everyone's understanding the capabilities now of the technology. Do you want to give a couple more minutes on that? I mean, I guess heat pumps, yeah, they're very much in the news, somewhat for the wrong reasons, and there's a lot of talk. And the average consumer, you know, one of our roles here is to remind people that a heat pump isn't just that small piece of kit, though they're very important to the domestic setting. The very huge heat pumps can be very useful, but it is new. It's new technology to a lot of people. So, you know, part of the role is spreading the word, isn't it? And so, you know, to the audience here, what's the scope we're looking at? Is it the answer to everything?
Nearly everything, I would say.
Okay, right.
I think there's a couple of things there just to pick up on. You know, the customers need to be really clear. Are they pursuing carbon reduction or cost reduction, or is it a combination of both? And setting that out at the beginning of a project is super important, because that will define choices that you make. But in terms of the heat pump technology, it's evolving. But of course, you know, it goes back to the 1800s, this technology. This is not new. Most of us have got at least two in our house, in your fridge and refrigerator. The natural refrigerant technology we've been working on has been around supermarkets for 12, 14 years, and is now very firmly established. It's the application of this technology in the heating that is new. So it's not the refrigerant cycle itself, but it's using that to generate heat and distribute it throughout buildings, especially complex buildings, and the retrofit challenge around some of the older buildings. I mean, we deal not only with healthcare, but with churches and scheduled monuments and things like that as well, where you can't change much inside the building. So we can, you know, we do heat pumps that will do 8271, so just replace your boiler. We can do up to 115 degrees using CO2, so you can do low temperature steam. You know, so there's not really a limit that you can apply the technology to, but it is about having that expertise available to you on your project. And I think as well, making sure that your project team is super aligned in its incentives. So making sure any consultants you're using, any contractors you're using are invested in your outcomes that you want as a customer. You know, because that's not the construction model that we generally have today. You know, and we're trying to change that with things like performance guarantee and funded models and things like that, where we will stand behind what we do as a manufacturer and as an installer. But I think from a customer's perspective, that's what you're looking for. Someone who is invested in your outcomes, But you clearly defined at the beginning of the project, and then everything else should roll through.
So yeah, so I guess you're saying that the ideal future is that partnership route. It's because as you say, construction and the world of heating and cooling has been largely in the past. You know, you supply the equipment. If you're lucky, you design the installation for the building services. But early engagement is, you know, something that's a relatively new thing, and it's a good thing because it allows everyone to optimize everything. And I guess that's what you all want to work towards. And probably even probably from your perspective too, Janet, early involvement is a good thing.
Definitely, it is, and also because especially if you're like what I said, you're bidding for PSDS, you need to have your supply chain already laid out, because it does you know, aid delivery, and with PSDS funding, its delivery is a key to it. So if you bid for a project and then start pulling together your supply chain and everything, then you will find yourself run out of time in getting it implemented. So, and also with like any other capital, if you can actually more or less pin down your cost right at the beginning, then you're in a better place, because you, as we all know, when it comes to overrunning capital, is always, you know, looked at especially at board level with a very squinty eye. So it's always good to actually have your supply chain ready, work with your supply chain and the designer, and see, because it doesn't mean that if you are actually, you know, inviting suppliers to talk to suppliers, gauge what's out there, because technology is technology. There's always something better that comes in, and it's then up to the design team and yourselves or ourselves to and based on informed decision on which technology will go with, and we only will have a good idea of that if we engage with the supply chain early.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm gonna. You mentioned funding again, and I'm gonna slide in a question at this point, because it's for you, Janet. What are your thoughts on ICSs and the distribution of NHS funding to support decarbonisation, including match funding and self-funding? You'll have to explain what ICSs are.
Yeah, it's integrated care systems, and we have the integrated care boards as well for each of the regions. So RWT and also our sister organization, which is also Healthcare NHS Trust, belongs to the ICS Black Country, West Birmingham ICS, and yes, I would say that there is always a scope to and every ICSS should explore it, a scope to actually get resources together and get funding, you know, through a system bid. The Black Country ICS has actually done that on PSDS 3B and was successful as a with it, and was granted about 35 million funding, and each of the trust also, depending on their slice of that, depending on the projects that was actually included in that bid, contribution as well. But it isn't an easy process. For us, it was actually led by our estates development director, the trust. So
I guess you have to work very closely with your estates director
Yes,
in
I
your
do.
world anyway. And
Yeah, I do, and I used to work actually as in estates development, looking at the front end, so the design process, and once all of that is done, including the business process, usually hand it over to capital team to build. But I do front end side of things, so I kind of know that the whole process. But it is. There is really scope, but it isn't an easy thing to do because it requires quite a good coming together of the different trust, and also having that understanding, and also willing to take on the possibility that they might have an abortive cost if the scheme is not funded, because, and that's hold true whether you are doing a system bid or you're doing an individual bid. There's always the abortive, that probability that you will incur an abortive cost. But for me, that isn't actually a loss, because for me it's an opportunity, because you already have a ready-made scheme then that might not be funded through PSDS, but maybe on a phase basis you can fund it in your capital as well. So there is that. I always look at things as, you know, win-win, more or less, on the side. Maybe people would say you're too optimistic, but in this job you have to be.
yeah, no, optimism isn't a bad thing in this sector, I think. Especially with the net zero targets coming up, we have to be optimistic. And in the face of political, what shall I say, intervention, I'm not allowed to talk about that too much because that would just derail us. But let's, on which note, there is something where the government has been involved. And so moving on to the to one of my other questions, in the elephant in the room is a rack-sized elephant that's cost a lot of money for a lot of buildings in the upkeep and the maintenance to sort that out. So that moved me on to a question in terms of balancing the budgets and balancing the reduction in carbon. Is maintenance or retrofit, is that actually more important in terms of addressing carbon and getting value for money than the new build, or is the new build just a bigger win? What do you think to that, Janet? And then I'll move on to the supply
Well,
team.
I did say about earlier about backlog maintenance, about PPM, about reactive maintenance, because whether it is an old or an existing estate and a new build, you still have to maintain, you still have to do reactive maintenance on it. I think the difference is that for older buildings you need to do more. Yeah, but it's about especially when it comes to budgets, is that a well-maintained building with a proper reactive maintenance regime put in place actually is better than just building new builds and then not maintaining it, thinking that, oh, it can stand there for 5 years because it's new anyway. Because by the time you go back to it, you end up with a lot more issues in it. So it's about really maintaining, getting the maintenance right, your preventative maintenance right, getting your reactive maintenance right, and also having a really good estates strategy, estates development strategy that then looks at and prioritize which buildings are really you need to still maintain and still leave standing, and which of the buildings actually you need to replace. Because the reality is there are buildings that no matter how many millions you pour into it, it is in that state where it will just be a bucket with a big hole at the bottom of it, and it will never become fit for purpose. So rather than actually looking at that as something that, oh, we'll just do it because it only costs $1 million, while actually building a new one would cost 10 million. But when you look at the lifetime of the how many years you can keep it limping along and how much money you're gonna pour in it, you'll find that actually building a new one and raising the other one is better, much better in terms of investment. And also, one of the things that needs to be looked at is that healthcare estate is there to support healthcare service provision. There are actually new standards and new ways of delivering healthcare services that needs to be taken into consideration as well, in terms of whether you maintain that building or actually replace it. And also for new build, people needs to look at that, particularly designers, because as we know, like outpatient departments, we're so used to having consulting rooms, examination rooms, procedure rooms, etc. For consulting rooms, we know that within the government strategy is the outpatient activities. 25% of it will be done by either telehealth or video consultation. So does that mean then that you still have to do 10 like for like consulting rooms, or are you actually going to do 7 and put 3 as a video consulting rooms, and you get 7 for what we call the usual face-to-face consulting? That then actually looks at the different types, because when you have that, that means then the normal consulting rooms requires lots of services. It requires more rigorous cleaning. It requires more. But if you have a video consulting room or telehealth room, that doesn't require that much. So in terms of cost per square meter, and in terms of your maintenance and operational and even end of life, that will actually make a lot of difference. So it's about being pragmatic on how you look at things and taking into consideration the progress of both the service delivery and also technology.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The changing face of patient interaction. I mean, I think one of the other things that we're always guilty of as a sort of covering the HVAC industry is we always think when we use the term healthcare, we're always thinking hospitals, when of course healthcare estates cover a lot of, as you said at the beginning, a lot of different buildings and a lot of different needs. And yes, each need will require a different solution. In terms of maintenance, I was going to come back to Jamie and say it's probably quite frustrating as someone who's part of whose world is insulation, that maintenance and carbon and energy comes up again and again, and you probably just wish you had more opportunity to get in there and engage with people, get that door open, or have the door open for you.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. I mean, I think there is a need, and certainly when we're looking at maintenance on properties, certainly when it comes to things like the issue around RAC, I think we have to be looking at how we can be improving those properties at the same time in relation to carbon and energy efficiency, as well as solving the RAC problem. Otherwise, again, we're in that scenario where someone else will be going in to do a decarbonisation project in 18 months, 2 years' time, and you get all the disruption that causes to the operation and the functionality of the different parts of the healthcare estate. So I do think that there is really an opportunity to optimise and to try and synergize some of these different solutions to really achieve the maximum overall reduction in carbon impact and acceleration to net zero as well.
I'm just pausing there because Tim has disappeared from view, so we've temporarily lost a panelist. So we'll busk around that by coming back to another question. Which is one that I like. I feel that I've been asking people on every webinar. Oh, look there, he's popped up again. You're just keeping me on my toes, Tim. Maintenance, then. Give me your view on maintenance and retrofit, because again, big heat pumps, we think often too much in terms of new build, and it's very simple in that respect, but very simple. It's a simpler prospect in that respect. But you think, do you not, that there's retrofit scope out there in aplenty with your technology?
Yeah, for sure. You know, retrofits 80% of the market, 80% of what buildings we're going to be using in 20 years' time. You know, it's super important. I'm really pleased to hear Janet talk about a combination of capex and opex, so capital cost and running costs, and how you make decisions around total cost of ownership and things like that. But yeah, you know, heat pumps require maintenance as much as anything, and keeping them in tip-top condition. And in particular, looking at the data that comes off them as well. So then no technology should be fit and forget. It should be fit, look at the data, optimize, and keep doing that in a continuous cycle. So you've got more than just cleaning it and maintaining it. You've got a data piece as well on top, because we're all chasing the last little bit of efficiency.
That's a very good point, in that the modern technology that and the controls in HVAC now allows a lot of data capture. And yeah, again, there's another webinar in optimizing the controls for your estate, because that's something that I think a lot of money can be saved as well as carbon. The debate has been so fascinating that I've allowed it to slip, and that we're right near the end of our time. So much more to talk about, but we'll have to just put it down to my famous last question, which was going to be, before Tim disappeared and I had to rescue him. It was about, so I was going to ask, what do you think the low-hanging fruit is in this is sort of wrapping up my final question in two. What do each of you think the low-hanging fruit is in carbon reduction, and what's the key message that you want people in the audience to take away? And I'm going to go in alphabetical order, because then it allows me to end with Janet, and she can wrap it all up for us very neatly. So Jamie, you're first. I guess you're going to say low-hanging fruits insulation, aren't you? That's
fabric first. Yeah, fabric first, Andrew. I think we need to be looking at fabric on any project where we're looking at decarbonisation. Otherwise, as I mentioned earlier, we're just going to put in renewable generation solutions and lose all the excess out of the building. So no, I think certainly fabric first needs to be the approach on any retrofit project from my perspective.
Is that your key takeaway as well? So you've answered with one sentence to both questions. It's very efficient of you, Jamie. Well done. So Tim, low-hanging fruit,
yep.
Part 1, and then part 2, other key takeaway.
So my key thing would be start small. You know, learn the technology on a smaller building, smaller project, understand how it works, and then apply it at big scale. If you go for the big thing straight away, you run into the complexity and the cost and everything else, and it will not be successful. So start small, have expertise in your organization, and make sure the incentives are aligned through the supply chain, and that you've got a really, really robust supply chain. Those would be my key pieces.
Thank you. Janet.
Hi, yes. What I would say is that we both agree with Jamie and with Tim. You need to look at start small, make sure you have reliable supply chain. Look at the problems of your building, and also this is one of the things that shouldn't cost much to anyone. It's really low-hanging fruit. Is to look at your preventative maintenance, your PPM. Make sure you do them, and it doesn't take money to actually continue maintain and do it. Second is look at your reactive maintenance. It's about, are you going to change like for like? If you have an opportunity to actually look at a more sustainable system or product that you need, even for bulbs, look at the more sustainable one, LED, that you don't need to actually change the fittings. You can look at the bulb, changing it. So it's about looking at just business as usual. work in it, and then look at your supply chain on that business as usual as well, and look at how you do things. So practices, that makes a lot of difference. And it's like one example I would say is our Cannock Chase Hospital Estates team. They took it upon themselves that any little money they've got left from doing new works, they actually invested it in changing all the lighting system in public access areas to LED. So, and they do it as part of their PPM and also reactive. So that, you know, the savings that they've realized and the carbon reduction is actually worth it. So it's about looking at what you already do and making a difference in that. Because the reality is funding from outside, like PSDS, is finite. It's about what we do in our business as usual that makes a difference.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. That's a great way to conclude the session. And we all look forward to hearing whether there's a new set of policy goals next year, or whether it's business as usual, or in whose hands we are next year for sustainability from above. But we as an industry and as clients will continue doing the right thing. So thanks to our speakers. I think you'll agree it's been a really useful discussion. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. The webinar is going to be available shortly to view on the Elemental website. So if you've got colleagues who haven't been able to see it, then you'll be able to view the recording very shortly. I have to end with an advert, which is if you're not already following Elemental on LinkedIn, please do so, or sign up to our newsletter at elementaldigital.co.uk. We've got another webinar tomorrow on healthcare and sustainability because we think it's important. So we're having 2 webinars in the week. We're going to look at sustainability in the round, and we actually have a consultant as part of the panel. So I'm definitely going to be grilling him on making sure that he's up with the latest technology. Please do sign up to that one at elementaldigital.co.uk. But it just remains for me to have one more thank you to our panelists. Very useful, very great insight, and we'll see you again soon. So thanks very much and goodbye.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.